So we just don't have the budget to make this project accessible. Well, the number of people who would benefit from making it accessible just really doesn't match to what our needs are. Hey everyone, so my name's Angela and I'm an accessibility designer. I've been doing it for 3 or 4 years now, and what that really means is I'm a graphic designer, I do UX design, but my main focus is making sure that all the designs that I produce are accessible to those who have disabilities. There are so many setbacks and so many struggles that I have faced and my colleagues face on a day-to-day basis where we get told, oh, we can't do this because of this reason. And they all think that they have a unique situation and that it's totally fine because it's an exception. Well, I'm here to tell you that they aren't the exception. And in fact, there are a lot of reoccurring themes that I've seen, and I want to point them out so we can just change that mindset when we're talking about making a design work for a wider range of people. Let's just get down to it and recognize that we need to be making things accessible so that people can be using them, and just stop making up excuses. Come on, people. This is a naive and comical thing that I hear all the time, that people with disabilities don't use the internet, so we don't need to worry about making designs accessible. You guys, are you serious? Come on. Everyone uses the internet. Like, at least in a country like the United States where I live, it's a privilege we have. Everyone has internet on their laptops. They can go to the library. They can use their phone. They can use their watch to use the internet. The internet is everywhere. And just because someone has a disability does not mean they're not going to be using the internet. Come on, people. This seems like a no-brainer. Let's just scratch that one for now. People with disabilities definitely use the internet. I have a disability and I use the internet. I could not have published this video without using the internet. The next thing people say all the time is, well, the number of people who would benefit from making it accessible just really doesn't match to what our needs are. And they're not our target audience, so we really don't need to make this accessible for them. Oh, you guys. Oh, you guys. 1 in 6 people will have a disability at some point in their life, whether it's long-term for their whole life or a temporary one. And that statistic doesn't even include the times when someone would need an accommodation. So one example I have to share where this kind of came up, and I luckily was able to explain to them that there are things that would come up even though it seems like there wouldn't be a ton of people with a disability using their product. So I was helping create an app. So it was for a private group of people, and in order to be in this group, you had to meet certain criteria. So it is true that in order to join this group, you couldn't have a severe disability, but they weren't taking into account that disabilities are a spectrum. So while there weren't people with severe disabilities, there were people who still would struggle with certain things when it came to accessibility. Example, color blindness was not a factor in whether or not you could be in this private group. Sorry, this all sounds vague, but I can't give out personal information about this project that I worked on. So me being an advocate, I explained to them and educated them on how there were certain groups of people who were still being affected, and there were ways that we could improve it for the overall population just by improving the accessibility. Even in the most extreme case where you're like, yeah, someone with a disability can't use this, there's still people who will benefit from making it accessible. So stop making assumptions that people with disabilities aren't going to be using your product or design. There will always be people who can benefit from making your design accessible. Going along with that is really people just saying, oh, well, the amount of people is so small that will actually use this, so it's not really going to affect a lot of people. So like I explained, 1 out of 6 people will have a disability. That's a pretty significant number if you ask me. So you're wrong, and it's definitely a significant number. Let's try to squash that myth that there's not very many people who will be using it. Another struggle I deal with on a regular basis is clients or whoever I'm working with coming to me and saying, well, we really don't want to affect the experience of the majority by making it a little bit different for someone who has a disability. Well, I know that if you do certain things to make a design accessible might affect the majority of people, just don't do that solution. There are so many different solutions that you can do in order to make it work for the majority of your people and also work for people with disabilities. So if you're really trying to make something accessible and you're trying to make one solution that works for everyone, it's just not gonna work for everyone, okay? Having multiple ways for people to interact and to use your design is how you're gonna be able to make it accessible. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to diversify how your users can use your experience. So what does this exactly mean? This means that you're adding alt text. This means that you're making it so a screen reader can use it, okay? If they can't use it how you want it to work, at least make it so they can use it in an alternative way by using a screen reader. Then they can actually use it. That's the least that you can do. You can add captions under a complex graphic or whatever to help someone who has cognitive disabilities, to help them understand a graph or a chart or whatever it may be so they can better understand it. Not saying that you should just do all these things instead of trying to make it accessible, but these are ways that you can make something accessible if you've tried everything you can to make it work for a wider range of people. You're never going to be able to get the full gamut. So that's why we have these tools in place to fill in those gaps. This next one is so frustrating as a designer who has a disability, a visual one. I don't want it to look bad. I want it to look good, and making it accessible will make it ugly. That is absolutely not true. I have seen so many beautiful designs that meet all the criteria for accessibility. You can definitely make designs that are accessible and that are beautiful. There's so many examples. Maybe I'll make a video or a post or something for you to show you so many good examples of designs that are accessible that are so gorgeous. And then we can just squash that one too, because seriously, that is the lamest reason to not make something accessible. And besides, making something accessible is not all about how it looks. All right, let's talk about the next thing. Okay, the next one is people saying, well, I'm not required by law exactly to make my product or my service accessible. So for sure, state and government entities all for sure 100% have to make their designs accessible. It's in the 508 laws, it's in the ADA laws, but it's a little more vague about private, small businesses, that kind of thing. So this reasoning comes up a lot. And because of that, people just are like, oh, I don't need to make my stuff accessible. But the reality is, just because it's vague doesn't mean that someone who has a disability who can't use your product, they could still sue you because something's not accessible. Because it says it needs to be accessible, but it just doesn't lay out strict like X, Y, and Z. These need to be followed in order to be called accessible. But the judges in court usually, from what I've heard, use the same standards for state and government just because it gives them a guideline of what should be done to make something accessible. And recently, there was a new law that was put out. I put a video all about it. I'll link it for you in this video so you can go watch that one. But also on top of that, like, do we really need a law to like say you need to do X, Y, and Z in order to make your design or product work for 1 out of 6 people? Do you actually truly not care about those customers using your products? Don't you want to make it so that you can have as many customers as possible and have them have a good experience and not just do the bare minimum? So we just don't have the budget to make this project accessible. I think maybe we can try to make the next project accessible, but for this project, we just don't have the money for it. This is such a common excuse as an accessibility designer I hear when people are talking about whether or not their project's going to be accessible. And what it really comes down to is poor planning and prioritizing other things and not realizing that accessibility is going to be way more time consuming and way more expensive for your budget if you're fixing things at the end and trying to make it accessible versus doing it from the beginning and throughout the design process. And not even mentioning the fact that if you get sued because your project isn't accessible, that's going to be a huge fine that you have to pay, and your project is still not accessible. So we really need to start prioritizing accessibility in the budget, and it really truly doesn't take that much money when you're looking at the full gamut of a project. The next one is super frustrating as an accessibility designer, and I'm telling you so that if you have any power over preventing this, please do. So at the beginning of every project that's brought up, I will say, does this project need to be accessible? What are we doing to make it accessible? And sometimes they'll be like, nope, this one's not going to be accessible. Don't worry about it. You'll have other projects. So then I'm like, okay, I'll just keep working on these other projects. Can't really do anything about it. But then they come back to me and they're like, oh, hey, this project's almost over, but we have to make it accessible. And it's just like, are you kidding me? I asked at the beginning, like, we could have done all this stuff from the beginning, and now we have to go back and jimmy rig this and just make it work, even though we could have so much easier and so much quicker done it from the beginning. So making a project accessible at the last minute, I'm not gonna say don't do it, because if it comes to making it accessible versus not making it accessible, because you're like, I don't wanna give them that work at the end, I will gladly take your work and I will gladly make it accessible, but it is so much better if you do it from the beginning. There's so many things that you can do in the back end and just making your design accessible from the beginning, okay? So please just be mindful, and if we plan ahead, then accessibility really isn't that big of a deal. You really don't have to notice that big of a difference when you're designing something. Okay, everyone, if you can't tell, I'm super passionate about this topic, and I have so many awesome videos on my channel. So if you like this one, give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to my channel so that you can see more content like this one in the future. Hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.